Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we're going to do a screencast on World War II, specifically the Pacific Theater of the War. And that's going to be a major conflict between the United States and Japan. Once again, not the European theater, not involving Italy or Germany and their allies, but instead the Pacific Ocean. So we're going to start off with 1941. The United States had a fleet. We had two fleets, a European fleet and a Pacific fleet. And the Pacific Fleet was stationed in Hawaii, not yet a state, but specifically in Oahu, Pearl Harbor. And our fleet is going to be there. It's going to be a formidable force, but it's all going to be nice and tucked in at Pearl Harbor. Japan, of course, saw the U.S. as a threat to it. And we were. We were absolutely a rival in the Pacific. We were fighting for power there. Japan was trying to conquer that area. We were trying to stop Japan. And they basically attacked our entire fleet, looking to take it out in one little 3-hour attack called Pearl Harbor, December 7th. So what they did then, they went on and continued to attack just about everywhere south of Japan. And their hope was to create a defensive perimeter so that the United States, once our Navy was destroyed, we would look at this area and be like, whoa, they have complete control there. This is hostile territory. And we won't even think about sending ships into that area. It's going to be too dangerous. So that was their hope, that we would give in and just settle for peace because we were in such a terrible position against them. So that was what they were hoping for, one big attack at Pearl Harbor and us just giving up. And really, there was Germany going on at the time, so they thought we would prioritize Hitler. But they were wrong because they really underestimated how angry we were that they killed about 2,400 of our people. So we don't give up so easy. We don't take that type of loss in the United States. So not that anybody does. So the war continues, and it's 1942, and Japan looks unstoppable. It's like they cannot be stopped. And they have crushed all the colonies of the Netherlands, of China, of Britain, and now the United States. I mean, they have taken on historically the strongest powers in the world. Now, why did they have so much success? Well, it's complicated, but part of the reason was the Arcadia Conference. So while Britain and Winston Churchill here were involved in a war against Germany, Churchill met with FDR at the Arcadia Conference, and they made a decision to prioritize not the Japanese, but instead the European war. And part of the reason they did this is they knew that Japan was kind of isolated out in the Pacific Ocean. It's not, as time goes by, they're not going to be able to do that much more damage. But the idea was the Nazis, though, they were steamrolling the British and the Russians. And the U.S. couldn't beat the Germans without the British and the Russians. So we needed to get in that war and save the British and save the Russians before they dropped out because we needed their help. So that was the idea. Over the next 2 years, we would take most of our resources, 80% of our supplies, our weapons, our soldiers, and we would send them not to the Pacific War, but instead the European conflict. And that's going to allow Japan to have some really early success in this war. So Japan has some success with conquering and creating their empire, which was known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So they were looking strong, undefeated. They had the largest navy in the history of the world, and they had this defensive perimeter that we were not willing to go in. So the U.S. Navy, meanwhile, was destroyed, and the remaining ships that we had were going to stay away from them. We were too scared to even go in. But we did still keep fighting where we had soldiers. And in 1942, we needed to pick a leader to lead these remaining soldiers, and that leader is going to be a guy named Douglas MacArthur. So Douglas MacArthur will go down in history as one of the greatest U.S. generals, and he will lead our troops against Japan. Dwight Eisenhower will lead our troops against Hitler. But that said, we're talking the Pacific War, right? So can Douglas MacArthur, as great and as smart as he is, stop Japan? They do seem unstoppable. So in 1942, Japan at this point has conquered all of these places that you see shaded with arrows, right? And now they're going to go after the Philippines, which was the strongest U.S. holding in the area. So there's the Philippines. It's really like over 3,000 islands, and they invade from the north on the largest island. The U.S. has 125,000 troops there. That's a lot. But the soldiers are now on their own. We can't send anybody to help them, give them more weapons or ammunition or food. They're left on their own. And we actually kind of lied to them. We said, help is coming, keep fighting. And help was never coming. And you could argue that was a little disingenuous, but FDR wanted them not to give up and wanted them to keep fighting. So they kind of eventually are going to run out of food. They weren't able to sleep. For weeks, they're battling, and the Japanese are coming at them. And of course, they're in the jungle, and there's mosquitoes with malaria and yellow fever. So they're going to retreat to the south, and eventually they get to this tiny little peninsula called Bataan. So they're going to retreat all the way down and down to Bataan. And that's when Douglas MacArthur retreats, and he's like, I'm out of here. I'm going to get conquered. I'm the leader. They can't capture me. And FDR orders him to get out of there. So he does. He leaves, and he famously says, I'm retreating, and I'm giving up my troops, but truly I shall return. This is not the last you've heard of me. So some people say the leader of a group should stay with their troops and get captured, but he was too important for planning our comeback. So they evacuated him. So this is the largest surrender in U.S. history. We have never had this many troops drop their guns, stop fighting, and give up. And that's still true to this day. 70,000 troops said, nope, we give up. I mean, they were tired, they were sick, and they were not healthy. So once our troops surrendered, the Japanese needed to figure out what to do with these troops. Armies aren't really prepared to take care of 70,000 people. Think of all the health needs they have and food needs, and just managing them, right? So they found a camp that they could throw these 70,000 people in, and they marched the soldiers 65 miles to it, to Camp O'Donnell. Now, this is going to be known notoriously as the Bataan Death March, because that march is going to turn out to be a huge war crime. Any of our soldiers that couldn't keep up because they were sick or dehydrated, or they just been fighting for a month, they would drop to the ground, and the Japanese would pull out their sword and decapitate them, just cut their heads off. It could be not a bigger war crime. We're talking hundreds of Americans. An estimated 500 to 650 Americans were executed, not given treatment or supported, just killed if they couldn't make that march in 110-degree weather. And, here's a famous picture of Americans carrying their dead brothers to the Camp O'Donnell to bury them there. So, I mean, it's going to be tragic and awful. Part of the reasons the Japanese didn't have any sympathy is part of their Bushido code was you never surrender. You fight to the death, and 70,000 Americans surrendering, they could not understand that. They had lost complete respect. They thought of Americans as the most dishonorable people ever to have 70,000 people surrender and not fight on. So they thought of them as animals, and they were willing to kill them. They were weak. Also, the Japanese didn't have an abundance of oil, so they marched everywhere, whereas Americans took vehicles. So Americans just weren't physically prepared to do all that marching, particularly after a month of difficult fighting, right? So now that the Philippines were now conquered, the Japanese have a new problem. And the problem is that they have been beating up America with all these small little fights and battles. But the thing is that America was not surrendering. What Japan needed was not a bunch of small victories, but what they needed was a knockout punch. And the reason is that America has 15 times the industrial capability of the Japanese, 15 times more factories. And because of that, once America mobilizes and gets ready for war, every tank the Japanese can produce, we can produce 15. Every plane, 15. And that 15-to-1 ratio will crush the Japanese empire the longer we stay in the war. So the Japanese have an advantage right now, but they will inevitably have to lose the war, not because of the bravery of their soldiers, but just because of our industrial output. So they have to knock the U.S. out of the war, or we will win the war eventually. So the Japanese need a knockout punch, and they're like, no more small battles. We need a huge fight. So they say Australia will be that huge fight. And the reason is they've conquered all this land, if you look at where these arrows are, but the U.S. has moved its base of operations from the Philippines to Australia. But the thing about it was, that's our last stand. Because if they can split the U.S. and Australia, then the U.S. is going to have to go all the way back to either Pearl Harbor or the U.S., and we can't conduct a war there. It's too far away. We would have to give up and make a peace. And that's what the Japanese wanted. So if they could just take over Australia or make it unsafe for us to stay there or separate us, then that's how they win the war. We'll sue for peace. And this is going to be the Battle of Coral Sea. So the Battle of Coral Sea, the sea is right around, Coral Sea is right around Australia. It's basically surrounding our top base where Douglas MacArthur is. And it's going to be the first ever naval battle between aircraft carriers, which is also a way of saying the first ever navies that never actually saw each other when they were fighting each other, kind of. So the new most powerful ship in the navies of World War II were the aircraft carriers. And the reason is battleships were the kings of World War I. Heavily armored, they can take a punch, they can give a punch. But the thing about battleships is aircraft carriers can be destroyed by battleships, but aircraft carriers can park 100 miles away from a battleship, and a battleship will never see it. Aircraft carriers will launch hundreds of planes that will sink a battleship without it ever getting a single shot off. And that's the key to aircraft carriers. So the Japanese aircraft carriers versus our aircraft carriers are going to be the Battle of Coral Sea. Now, that battle is going to occur, and it's going to turn out to be a tie. Now, ultimately, though, the Japanese are going to get beat up enough, even though maybe they slightly won, that they're going to have to retreat without accomplishing their objective of kicking Douglas MacArthur out of Australia. So the war continues, and Douglas MacArthur is there to stay. Now, why is this a problem for Japan? Well, we already talked about it. They needed a knockout punch. The U.S. can't think that they can win this war because then we'll stay in the war. And if we stay in the war, even though we're losing the war, we will eventually know we'll win because of our industrial output of 15-1 advantage. So the Japanese know that even though they've won pretty much every battle, that they are vulnerable to losing the war. And that's a problem. So what they need is an all-in battle. They lost, or should I say they didn't win the Battle of Coral Sea, so they need another chance at a all-or-nothing battle. And they look at Midway Island for that all-or-nothing battle. This tiny little insignificant island, but is the closest island to the Japanese Empire at this point and has an airstrip to launch our Air Force there. And that's what made it so valuable. So the Japanese put 150 ships together. It is the largest offensive navy ever in the history of warfare. And that navy is going to go after Midway. And the whole point is they're going to attack this island to basically do an all-or-nothing battle. And the historical lesson here is they're going to put all of their eggs in one basket. They want to knock the U.S. out of the war. But if they lose this battle, they're going to lose their navy. And that's going to turn the tide of the war. So perhaps you shouldn't take that big of a risk of a battle. But they're going to do it, and it's going to be called the Battle of Midway. Battle of Midway is going to be a fantastic tactical and strategic battle. And we don't have time to talk about it here. Of course, there's the famous movie that was made recently and plenty of books. But ultimately, the U.S. wins that battle and takes out 3 out of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which are the backbone of that navy. We take out an endless amount of their ships. And we do it basically with our naval intelligence because they didn't know we were about to attack them. So the Battle of Midway is going to be the turning point because we crush the Japanese Navy. It is wounded and it just basically limps back to Japan after this. And from then on, we're going to have the offensive advantage. We're going to have the larger, more powerful Navy. And the Japanese Navy is no longer intimidating. So it's really just before the Battle of Midway, the Japanese would win every battle. After the Battle of Midway, we would win just about every battle. And so now we're going to march through the Japanese Empire and get our way to Japan, right? Because we can win all the battles in the world, but until we conquer Japan, the war is not over. So we have to march to Japan. So as of 1943, General MacArthur has won the Battle of Midway, and he's now like, well, I got to get to Japan. And the problem is there are hundreds and hundreds of islands that the Japanese have occupied and fortified on the way to Japan. And that's a problem for the U.S. Just to conquer every one of them will lead to hundreds of thousands of American deaths, if not millions. And that is too big of a price to pay for America. We can't afford that. So MacArthur says, well, we can't sustain that. We need a new idea to win this war. And he comes up with an old idea called island hopping. And so what is island hopping? Well, intuitively, what you do is you fight every island on the way to Japan because you don't want to leave an island behind you because then you'll be trapped between 2 enemy forces. But what he says is no, we're going to leave enemies behind us. And kind of the idea is that if you look at this tree, it's covered in poison ivy. And if you want to kill poison ivy because you hate poison ivy and it's a threat to you, you could take some spray, some pesticide, and spray every single leaf to kill all that poison ivy. Or what you could do is you could spray the very bottom of the poison ivy, and that kills the roots of the poison ivy, which will kill all the leaves without spraying them. And that is the principle of island hopping. You don't have to fight every island or every Japanese soldier. If you can just get in front of them, you will cut off their supplies, their roots, their food, their reinforcements, and then they will have to surrender without fighting them. So the plan is to attack weak islands of the Japanese that will be minimal losses, and then blockade the strong islands from behind. And then they won't be able to be reinforced or get ammunition or food, and you will defeat those Japanese soldiers without actually fighting. So MacArthur said, hit them where they ain't, let them die on the vine, which really hits our analogy, our metaphor, right? So the plan is working. We're hopping island to island. It's still a bloody war, but we're hitting the least defensible islands, which is good. Skipping over the fortified islands. And in 1943, marching to Japan, Japan comes up with a new strategy. They know they can't win the war now, not after Midway, but their new strategy is to inflict so much damage on the American invaders that we will just sue for peace. We will sue for a compromise to end the war on mutual terms. And so they start doing things like kamikaze attacks, which they had not done previously. Kamikaze attacks is when Japanese pilots will fly directly into US ships and take the ships out. And the reason is that normally Japanese planes would drop bombs from really high up, and that means they would really miss. But now the Japanese planes would load up those planes with an endless number of bombs and not drop them from a mile up, but actually fly their planes 300, 400 miles per hour through our ships and then have a much larger explosion. And what that meant was the plane going that fast could penetrate the hull of the battleship, blow up from the inside of it, and sink the ship with just one missile that is the plane. So a kamikaze attack is so much more deadly than a plane normally would be. And they won't miss because they can fly right into it. And even if the kamikaze plane gets shot down, they can just steer straight into our boats. The most vicious and difficult to stop. They're going to do so much damage on our ships. And you can see all these images now of kamikazes attacking. But kamikaze attacks, great short-term, policy, tactical advantage, but terrible tactic in the long term or strategy, because Japan didn't have a lot of pilots, so they were killing their pilots. They also didn't have a lot of oil to train new pilots, so eventually they destroyed their own air force and gave us complete control over the skies. So the war does go on, and Japan is losing, and Americans are dying trying to march towards Japan, but still Japan isn't surrendering, which is pretty counterintuitive. So the year is 1944. We've been in this war for 3 years. The United States is losing so many lives, but we're winning, and we want a new strategy. And the strategy is, well, they're not surrendering, so why don't we take away their ability to fight a war? Let's destroy their factories. If we can take out the factories that are making the guns, the planes, the tanks, then they can't use them anymore. So every day we send up hundreds of B-29s. These are these monstrous, huge planes, and we're going to drop an endless amount of bombs on their factories. And when we do that, they will lose their ability to make weapons and conduct war. Now, that will cause them to surrender, right? So this new strategy. But the problem is U.S. bombers on their way to Japan to bomb them are getting shot down. And the reason is bombers are slow. They're carrying a lot of weight, and they're big and clunky. So you know what's faster than a bomber? A fighter plane. And if you look at this map, as we're coming from the Mariana Islands, because we've conquered them, we have to fly past Iwo Jima. And Iwo Jima has an airstrip. You can see it on this picture. And planes would come up and shoot down our bombers, and it's not a good thing. So we decide to actually attack Iwo Jima. So our reconnaissance said that, wow, it's not heavily fortified at all. There's an airstrip, but we don't see any Japanese soldiers there. Little did we know that when we invaded, they were hidden in this volcano here and other parts of the island. The Japanese had spent years digging out the inside of this volcano and other parts of the island to basically make hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels. And that when we came onto this island, they opened fire at the same time. Hundreds of guns all at the same time. This is going to be one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. In fact, I think a quarter of the Medal of Honors of the entire World War II came from this battle alone. So again, that is completely hollowed out, right? So today you can visit as a tourist destination, go into these tunnels. They basically had the equivalent of a small town in Massachusetts, number of soldiers hidden in this island, about 30,000 soldiers. So instead they could get in there and suddenly they would just be shooting out of all these hidden holes. And again, really a magnificent battle. So it's going to last 36 days. This island we thought was basically virtually uninhabited, but ultimately the U.S. has victory. Iwo Jima was most famously covered when we finally conquered the top of that volcano, and 6 soldiers are going to put up a flag and it's basically claiming this mountain as our own. And that's going to be a very famous picture. Today it's kind of an image of the Marines that they've adopted as for their branch of the military. 6,800 Americans died on that island in that battle. The biggest lesson was the Japanese had 21,000 soldiers there, and only 216 of them surrendered. So they fought to the death, and that's going to be a lesson. Now that's going to be a lesson for us, because if we're going to invade Japan to end this war, and all of Japan's never going to surrender, that's going to be an unacceptably bloody end to this war, and that's not going to be okay. So we now have access to unlimited bombing of Japan. So Iwo Jima is now, we can actually fly planes from it rather than get attacked from it. So 1945, 4 years of war, we now are bombing changes, and we're like, bombing traditional bombs is not working. We want to try something else. So instead of strategic bombing, we switched to fire bombing. And our bombing campaign is not traditional bombs, but instead bombs that are filled with a type of napalm, liquefied gasoline, jellified gasoline. And this new weapon is called firebombing because Japanese homes are predominantly wood. And so you could drop one bomb and that fire could spread forever and ever. One bomb becomes 1,000 bombs. And Japanese are so overpopulated that their homes are all built together. So if you bomb one place, it will spread to every other place. So one tiny bomb becomes a huge bomb. That's why they're so effective. And if you want to hear the physics of it, we would create firestorms. So we would create a fire. The fire would burn so hot because you couldn't put it out. Napalm, you could throw water on it, it would not easily be extinguished. And that massive amount of fire creates so much heat that that heat rises up because of physics. And when that air rises up, there's no air at the low point of the city at the low altitude. And as physics will tell you, you can't have a vacuum like that. So when the heat rises, the air rises, air has to come from somewhere. And as the air gets pushed up, the air from way up there has to come down. And it has a much longer it has a much longer space to cover. So that creates wind. It's going because of the different air pressures. It will go so fast that will create the wind. Now that wind is going to come down and feed those fires to make them bigger, but it's also going to spread those fires, all that wind, right? And so you basically have a wave of fire moving faster than a human being can run, even the fastest human being ever. So now you have the hottest fires and the fastest winds, and the fires spreading. So 1945, March 9th and 10th, the B-29s are going to attack Tokyo and firebomb it. And we are going to take out the entire city. That city, that river is going to be boiling. It's that hot. Non-exaggeration, people would jump in the water to get away from the flames and boil to death. This is going to be the most vicious attacks maybe in the history of the world. 100,000 people are going to be killed in Tokyo. That's more than the atomic bombs had killed, at least initially. And again, we weren't killing soldiers there. There were some soldiers, obviously. We were killing civilians. We were killing babies, women, men, children, grandparents. And we firebombed 65 cities in Japan just to wipe them out, as you can see on this map. We did a complete number. If you want to talk about war crimes, a lot of people say the United States went after civilians here on purpose, the number of civilians that we killed. Of course, Japan did not surrender. And, the U.S.'s goal was to get them to surrender, even with all of those attacks. So we're in 1945. We're now in April. We've been firebombing Japan. And now we're attacking Okinawa, which is part of Japan proper. And, it's not a colony or a conquered place, but we're actually attacking Japan now. And in that battle, you could study that battle forever, but the takeaway of the Okinawa, which we do win, and it's one of the biggest battles of the war, even bigger battle than Iwo Jima, is that the civilians actually joined their soldiers in attacking Americans. And this taught us a lesson that if we invade Japan to end this war, we aren't just going to have to fight Japanese soldiers, we're going to have to fight civilians. And that's going to result in a massive amount of death, even if we win. So if we have to go door to door fighting civilians, and that's an impossible war to win. So that's going to teach us something, because in Okinawa, we had to fight cave to cave. It wasn't like we were winning, so the Japanese gave up and then the battle was over quickly. We had to keep fighting even after we won. And that was awful. And another lesson, many Japanese women and children and families jumped off the cliffs. They had been told that Americans were going to come and rape, pillage, and destroy their families and execute them. And they were not willing to accept that or let that happen to them. So they killed themselves right in front of American soldiers, thinking that we were going to harm them. And many of them, due to the Bushido Code, weren't willing to surrender and committed suicide anyway. And that's going to show that when we invade, that it was possible their entire civilian population was going to kill themselves. And that's a really negative side to this war. We couldn't let that happen. In other parts of the Okinawa battle was normally when you fight an army and you surround them and strategically beat them, they give up and they become prisoners, but they don't lose any more lives and you don't lose any more lives. But the Japanese didn't do that. When they got surrounded, they actually would lead banzai charges, which basically means long live the emperor, and they would take out a bunch of our soldiers even after they were defeated. And all of them, of course, would be killed as they charged. And that would result in a massive extra amount of death for both sides. And that was very sad. Once again, it showed that if we keep fighting the Japanese, if we invade Japan, it is going to be unsustainable losses because of these banzai charges, the civilians hopping in, and these mass suicides. So the lesson was they're not surrendering. We don't know if they ever will. And the invasion of Japan is going to be awful. So we keep conquering. We're up to Japan now. They're still not surrendering. We are going to have to invade Japan. We begin preparing to invade Japan to end this war. And we are ready. Now, that picture was actually the invasion of Normandy, but I was just showing it for, conceptual ideas. So anyway, Japan here, we're ready to invade. There are some estimates that we'll lose 1 million lives, 500,000 lives, 250,000 lives. But either way, why so many? Well, because on Iwo Jima, the defenses that were dug were just show that they were ready to fight forever. The Okinawa suicides, the Okinawa civilians hopping in. So it's just that we're in for a battle. So 1945, July 17th, something changes. We get a new invention finally. So this is 1945 July, and we have created 2 nuclear bombs. One called Little Boy that uses uranium, and one called Fat Man that uses plutonium. Now, the idea was that in July, Germany has already been defeated, and the big 3 come together. Now, at this point, we're talking Winston Churchill, Stalin, but now FDR is dead, and it's now Truman. And the big 3 are meeting in Potsdam. Remember, Germany's conquered, and they decide at this conference to issue a declaration at the Potsdam Conference to Japan. And it is, Japan, we have defeated Germany. You need to surrender immediately. If you don't, you will face prompt and utter destruction. And that is a warning. Now, some people criticize this warning by saying we should have said we will have nuclear weapons and we will unbelievably kill you. But instead, we use a coded phrase, you're going to face prompt and utter destruction. One would say that that was a meaningless warning because they already were facing that. So, Japanese, this was their concerns, that the US had demanded unconditional surrender. So they were worried that we would forever occupy and own Japan, which would mean they would forever lose their land, their rights, their freedoms. So they had to fight on. They thought that we would enslave their race, just like other places in the last 200 years that white societies had enslaved through imperialism. So they had reason to think that. They thought that we would execute all of their leaders. And guess what? Who was making the decisions about whether to surrender or not? Their leaders. They didn't want to die. Emperor Hirohito was considered a god in Japan, and they were convinced we were going to execute him. And to be honest, that probably might have been the plan. So they didn't want that to happen. And they kept saying, how about we keep our emperor and we will surrender? And we weren't willing to do that. We said unconditional. We'll do what we want with everything. So I would argue, the history books emphasize that Japan was unwilling to surrender. I would almost disagree. I would say that they reached out to a number of countries, including the Soviet Union, including Sweden, I think even in Switzerland, and said, can you negotiate a surrender with the United States? We just want to keep our emperor and whatnot, and we weren't willing to hear it. So I think the United States made a mistake. If we were willing to conditionally accept their surrender, we could have avoided using the atomic bomb altogether. So that said, we didn't need to do an invasion. The U.S. often says, well, if we didn't drop the atomic bombs, we would have had to invade, and that was unacceptable. I would say under revisionist history, no, we could have just said, we'll let you keep your emperor. We will not enslave your people, and they would have given up. But that said, we kept saying, well, no, we're going to have to invade. That's a lot of deaths, so we needed to drop the bombs. The invasion was set for November, and of course, we were warning them at the Potsdam Declaration in July. So our new invention, Little Boy and Fat Man, were our 2 bombs. And we had a third, but we actually used that in the US to see if they would work. So we've now used one of our 3. And on August 6th, the Japanese still didn't surrender. And Paul Tibbets is going to get in his plane, the Enola Gay, I think named after his mother-in-law. And he's going to drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And he's going to take this picture with his own camera as he dropped it with a parachute and then got out of there as quickly as possible and took this picture. And that is Hiroshima getting knocked out pretty badly. So this is what Hiroshima looked like afterwards. 70,000 plus people killed. Japan still didn't surrender. And on 3 days later, it was supposed to be August 12th. We wanted to give 5 days to give Japan to get to their senses and surrender. But the weather looked bad on the 12th. So the military, without even asking Harry Truman, president, moved it up to the 9th and dropped the bomb again. And he actually chewed them out later and said, you shouldn't have done that. You needed my permission to do that. But anyway, on August 9th, we dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki, which was the plan. It was a plutonium bomb, which actually is ignited by a uranium bomb. But that said, they died. It was less casualties in Nagasaki. One, because the bomb missed by about 40%, but second, it was a smaller place, so only 35,000 people died, at least initially. So that's going to be August 9th. And Japan at this point, what we got as an agreement from the Yalta Conference way back was that Russia was willing to attack Japan 3 months after Germany was surrendered. So that said, Russia did to the day, 3 months in, attacked the Japanese soldiers in Manchuria. Now, why were they doing that? Yes, we made a deal with them, but also they were hoping to get control of that area after the war. So Russia invades, and now Japan's like, crap, the biggest country in the world is now joining the war against me. Previously, Japan and Russia had a 10-year agreement that they wouldn't attack each other. Russia broke that, and now Japan is in trouble. So on August 15th, Japan is now shocked from the atomic bombs and from the Russian invasion that they need to surrender, and surrender they do. The emperor overrides his military leaders and says, nope, we are surrendering. He goes on the radio and he announces to the Japanese people, we are done. We have been defeated. And this is now known as VJ Day, Victory Over Japan. And it is World War II is now over, the worst war in the history of the world. We've never had something worse since. And this is one of the iconic pictures. People were kissing each other, running around Times Square, and our country was unbelievably happy, right? Weirdly enough, for years, this picture is going to be famous, and it was only in the last 10 years that this has changed. In Times Square, they've even had a statue of this famous iconic video, and later, the woman that got kissed was identified as Greta Zimmer, and she said, I was forced to kiss him. I wasn't kissing him. He grabbed me and forced me to kiss him. And it became like 50 years later, 60 years later, an example of toxic masculinity of men and sexual harassment and how women didn't have choices in this. It wasn't my choice to be kissed. The guy just came over and grabbed me, she said. That man was very strong. I wasn't kissing him. He was kissing me. I did not see him approaching, and before I know it, I was in his tight grip. So that, weirdly enough, that's an example of how history can change. They took down that statue, and now that's kind of demonized, this iconic picture of VJ Day. So on September 2nd, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese formally surrendered on the USS Missouri, and here they are signing the actual agreement, right? Their empire will be removed. World War II is finally over, and that was a brief summary of the Pacific War. Obviously, there's so much more to learn from it, but that was the basics. So thank you for staying with me on the summary of the Pacific War. Hopefully, we'll have other, stay tuned for other World War II screencasts. Thank you so much.